So my name's Kieran Hyder. For those of you that don't know me, I work for Cefas. I do lead on advice for Cefas, which I do a lot of advice for government, for Katie and others, and I'm involved a lot in research. I probably should offer this as well. My email's at the end of the slides, so if people have questions, then please feel free to drop me an email. And I can do my best to help. I can't guarantee that I can answer your questions, but I might know someone that can if I don't. So I know that it can be quite difficult because there's often you think there's government as a faceless organisation, but I'm trying to make sure you've got a face to talk to at least. So that's a good start. So I got given a very, very narrow title here of sea bass biology, ecology and fisheries. So I've got 35 minutes to do that justice, and everyone else has got the rest of the day to kind of talk about small aspects of it. So what I'm intending to do here is just to signpost a little bit some of the talks. I'm going to talk you through a little bit of the stuff that we do in a very, very broad way, and some of the key bits of research that myself and others have been involved in. So, oh, there we go, an outline of the talk. So I'm going to talk really about the distribution and life cycle, spawning, the pelagic, and then the different phases of the life cycle, the pelagic phase, the nursery phase, and the adult phase. I'm going to zip through those a little bit because you're going to have lots and lots of talks about them later. And then I'll focus in a bit on the fisheries, trying to talk a little bit about the catches, how the stock assessment works in loose terms, the management. I've also got a single slide on economic and social, but there are some slides at the end of this. So when you get the slides distributed, there are some others on economics. I just couldn't do everything today, I'm afraid. So let's start with bass biology and ecology. So bass is a widely ranging species. It ranges pretty much from North Africa all the way up to Norway. So it's through the Mediterranean as well, and it varies a bit over the areas in terms of how it grows, and a bit from a genetics perspective as well. And you can see here on the right-hand side, there's a kind of stylized life cycle of the sea bass. You can see that if we start from the fertilized eggs, you get eggs that float in the plankton, and they grow up to about 15 millimeters in length before they metamorphose and settle in inshore areas. They inhabit kind of estuaries and shallow embayments for between 1 and 4 years, and then they start to mature, and they will mature as males and females at males about between 32 and 36 centimeters, females a bit bigger, 40 to 45 centimeters. And that's when they'll start to kind of join the adult spawning migrations. They may migrate to inshore spawning grounds or offshore spawning grounds, where they'll chuck out their eggs, and the whole life cycle starts again. So what I'm going to try and do is talk you through aspects of this, and just talk a little bit about that. So the pelagic phase. So this happens in the water column essentially. So eggs and larvae are spawned. It took me ages to find a nice picture. I had to go back to a book from years ago, and you can see the stages of development from the eggs at A through the larva with the yolk sac. So it hasn't started feeding yet in B, and then the first feeding stage, and then they kind of grow a little bit more. And at E is really when they start to settle in the nursery areas that we see. And that's starting to resemble more the bass that you might see as you do. So they drift in the plankton for 50 to 70 days. They've developed through all the different stages. There's quite a high mortality, so a lot of them get eaten by things. They die because they can't feed, or they can't find stuff to feed on, or they might not end up in coastal areas because they're at the the perils of the currents, basically. The sex ratio is driven by temperature. It's thought to be set early in the pelagic phase. So basically, if you've got warmer temperatures, you tend to get a higher proportion of males than females. As I said, the drivers of success have been investigated. So this is some work that Jenny, who's sitting in the room, did. So we can't actually say a lot about exactly what happens in the pelagic phase. We can't go out and monitor it and collect data throughout it. So what we can do is we can collect data when they start to spawn in terms of the eggs and larvae, how they grow, how they survive, and then we can collect information on where they settle. And what we can try and do is use models to talk a little bit about how we go from one to the other. So Jenny's done a lot of work thinking about how we model the pelagic phase of sea bass. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to understand the connectivity. So if bass are spawned in a certain place, where do they end up settling? And what's the likelihood of them ending up settling there? And that's what modeling can help you do. So we've got some very intelligent people like Jenny who set up these massive hydrodynamic models, which model all the covenants, and we chuck sea bass virtually into these models and they drift around. And what we can then do is we can look at where the bass are spawning compared to where they're settling, and we can look to see whether we can understand what the important spawning areas are and where we can protect, because those would have a disproportionate benefit to the stock as a whole. Because say if you look on this chart and you look down, say, I don't know, up here in the middle of the North Sea. So if we had a larvae that was spawned here, it would probably drift up here and would not really likely to settle or inhabit our nursery areas. So that's what we're trying to end up and understand here. And that's what these pictures on the right tell us. They tell us a little bit about how important a particular area is in terms of its spawning to the numbers that arrive at the coast. Ian McCarthy will be talking a lot more about this later, so I'm going to signpost you to things that he's doing. So let's move on to the nursery areas. So in the nursery areas, I said, juveniles will spend up to 4 years in the nursery areas. What you tend to do is you tend to get a gradation from the top of the estuaries down, with younger and smaller fish inhabiting the top. And then as you come further out, you get bigger fish. This is the time which is thought to drive the year class strength. So the size and the number of adult bass that you see is thought to be set in this period here. And that's kind of driven by two things quite often. What people think is that it's the amount of larvae that end up in that area, and it's whether they actually survive the first winter. Because generally sea bass are quite small when they settle, between 15 millimeters, and there's thought to be a kind of size threshold. If they get to 60 millimeters, then they probably got the energy reserves to survive the first winter, because it's cold and there's a lot of stress on them. So in terms of diet, they start off feeding on quite small stuff, things like mysids and shrimps and stuff like that, and then they move into crustaceans and polychaetes and then mollusks, and then as they get bigger, they'll start to eat fish as well. They have tidal movements. So if you look at this picture on the left here, on the right, this is a stylized version of an estuary. So if you can think about this, this is an estuary, and you might have areas of salt marsh up the top, and you might have areas that are covered at high tide but uncovered at low tide. So what the bass tend to do is they tend to move up into the intertidal areas as the tide comes in, and they'll feed there and then they move out. We also see seasonal movements, which Howard and Joe will talk about later, I think, where we see that in winter, because the temperatures are very cold in the shallow waters, they can't survive up there, so they tend to migrate out into deeper water. One of the challenges we have is around the carrying capacity. So what I'm talking about here is how many sea bass can survive in an estuary and how important that estuary is to the adult population, so the fish that you'll catch. So it might be that we look at an estuary, I don't know, like the Crouch or Blackwater, something over here, and maybe that has a massive impact and all of the bass from there are successful at becoming adults. And there might be another estuary, I don't know, something like one of the North Norfolk rivers, where maybe there's quite a few bass in there, but they're not very successful at making the adult population. And this is something that's really important for us to understand, is how important protecting each of these estuaries is to the adult stock. And Anna will be talking a lot more about that and the work that she's done around trying to understand how important each of these individual estuaries are to the overall adult population. There's also a lot of impact of different habitats. So different habitats within an estuary have different values to the bass that are in there. So there's a lot of work that suggests that salt marsh is really, really productive and it's a really important habitat for bass. And Rachel, wherever she is, over there, we'll be talking more about this later. So the idea of this talk is really just to introduce you to the broad concepts, and then we can drill down into some of the detail as we move on. So year class strength. So this is what really you guys as anglers and commercial fishers are really interested in. So it's how many big bass do we have? How many bass are coming through? So if you look at the data that we've got over time, there was a massive year class that came through in 1989. And that was something that people fished on for maybe 20 to 30 years afterwards, because that's the lifespan of a sea bass. And we had other big year classes in 1997 and 2000. And progressively since 2010, we haven't really seen those big year classes coming through. It's been a lot lower. And that's one of the things which is an issue for us moving forwards. So we've tried to work and understand what is driving the size of those year classes. So we've used data that's been collected in the Thames, the Solent, in fact, in the Fal and the Helford by Robin and his co-workers in Bass, the Helford Angling Survey or Bass Survey. It's a great example of citizen science, and it's the kind of thing that we're here to talk about this afternoon. And I know that Steve Colclough has been doing a massive amount of stuff in this area. We also got data from Kieran over there, from Ireland, around the rivers in Ireland. And what we can do is we can try and link up what we know about what's in the estuaries to the kind of things that might drive it. So what we're trying to understand is it kind of small predators like herring or anchovy or sprat that are eating all of the things when they're drifting around in the plankton? Is it slightly bigger bass eating the younger bass in the estuary, so cannibalism? Is it, whether there's food there for them to eat when they're drifting around? Is it to do with shock as the cold temperatures come in through either the sea surface temperature or influx of fresh water? So, and what we can see is that each of these estuaries has different things that drive the abundances that we see. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not very easy to predict how beneficial kind of different management measures might be to protect the stock. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the adults. So adults, these are the things that you might catch on a daily basis. Here's some big ones that I saw in Vigo in a fish market. So again, you're going to see a bit more of this from Mathieu later, who's going to talk a lot about site fidelity to spawning and feeding areas. So you guys will know that sea bass, they swim around, they move quite large distances, but some of them will come back to the same areas. I've seen records from anglers where they caught the same big bass in the same place 2 years running at the same time. You know, and it's quite, with big bass, it's quite easy to tell with these things. So, you know, so they do have some kind of fidelity to their feeding areas. But it's not clear. Some bass can swim really big different distances. So we've tagged bass that will swim all the way from the North Sea, round through the Channel, up into the Irish Sea, and back again on a yearly basis. So some of them are traveling really big distances, and some of them, others that we've tagged off Lowestoft, will just stay in the North Sea. So, as I said, females grow faster than males. They tend to grow a bit faster. The maturity sizes, these are the sizes at average maturity, and the 41 centimetres is close to what is the minimum conservation reference size at the moment. So the management from that perspective is based on the size of average first maturity. As I said, sex is temperature dependent, with more males produced at higher temperatures. And as I said, they've got large scale movements. And as you guys know, they'll take lots and lots of different things. They're generalist predators. They'll eat worms, they'll eat crabs, they'll eat mollusks, they'll eat fish. You know, they are a voracious predator. So just to close that life cycle, we're going to now talk a little bit about spawning. So spawning, so these sea bass will migrate to their spawning areas. And it's an annual development cycle. So the sea bass will start to feed, and then they'll start to produce eggs, and they'll go through until they're ripe, lots and lots of different stages in their bodies until they're ripe, and then they'll aggregate to spawn. And basically, they're broadcast spawners, which means that they spawn into the water column. There's theories that they rise up and down off the seabed to spawn. And generally, the males are ready before the females are ready, and they're ready after. So the males are ever ready, and the females generally, they're the ones that we really want to understand the spawning period. Females, they reckon that there's about 500 eggs per gram of body weight. So an average size bass probably has 2 million eggs in it. It's quite a lot of eggs. And they aggregate to spawn in certain areas, and they release their eggs into the water column. And the timing of that release is thought to be due to two things. It's thought to be due to a combination of the day length, so the photoperiod, so how long that day is, and also the temperature. So things can only spawn when the temperature goes above a certain level, because there's no, the eggs won't survive otherwise. And what you can see on the right-hand side here is you can see a progression of the months of spawning throughout from lower latitudes to higher latitudes. Anna really sensibly pointed out that this should be flipped on its head, because the bottom would be the south and the top would be the north. But for this, let's think that we're in the southern hemisphere, and we'll stand on our head and just imagine it, okay? So, so basically what you can see is the progression as you move up through Portugal into France and into the UK. You move from kind of the November to January time, or February, all the way up to April, May, June, as you get into the kind of into the middle of the UK. And there is some information on the location, but it's quite limited, because it's quite difficult to go out and study the release of eggs. It's very expensive, and it's very difficult because it's very variable. But we do have some theories about where they're spawning. There are some theories about spawning in the southwest, in the middle of the Channel, and also potentially some areas in the North Sea and the Irish Sea. And I think that Joe is going to talk a little bit about how there's a linkage between, or a mismatch between, the management measures, the closed seasons, and the protection for spawning. And it's something that I know that a lot of you guys have told me about as well. And it's something that DEFRA are definitely interested in as well. So adult behaviour. So I said that, that fish swim quite long distances. And you'll hear more about this again from Mathieu, and also Tom over there, Tom Stamp, who will be talking about the work that they've been doing. But we'll focus just on the work that Cefas have done for a second. So here we tagged about 500 fish, I think, and we got about 50 tags back, and they were tagged in around Lowestoft, around Weymouth, and also in the Irish Sea, Liverpool Bay. And what you can see from this is that we've combined the electronic tagging. So there are two types of tagging. There's the type of tagging where you just stick a dart into the thing and it has a number on it. And then every time that fish is caught again, you can record it being caught, you record the number, and you know where it was when you released it, where it was when you caught it. That's called conventional tagging. The other thing that you can do is you can put what we call electronic tags, and they're implanted in the body cavity of fish, and they record the temperature, the depth, and the temperature, depth, and sometimes other parameters. But what we can do from that is that we can reconstruct their movements on a daily basis using some very fancy statistics, which are well beyond me, but and I won't go into them in any detail. But the long and the short of it is that basically what we see from the fish that we've got, so on this side, you can see that these different colours represent the different months. So you can see the kind of dark blue is month 12 and the really light blue is month 0. You can see some individual tracks here. So you can see one that was tagged up in Liverpool Bay and it comes down into the Celtic Sea. You can see one that was tagged off Weymouth that goes all the way across the channel and back again. You can see one that was tagged off Lowestoft that just sat around in the North Sea. But what we can do is we can try and generalize these types of patterns, which is the bit in the middle. And what people think at the moment is that we have a kind of contraction in winter where everything moves south, regardless of where it sits. It moves south and east and west, sorry. And then in summer, it moves north and east. And that's the general pattern that we're seeing. And you'll see a lot more of that from Matthew later. So one of the problems that we have is that we don't have any information on what the population of sea bass looks like. We don't have what we call fisheries surveys, where people will go out with a research vessel and will collect data on sea bass. And what that would allow us to do is to monitor how the population is changing over time. So we have to think about how we can model this, to think about how we might come up with some ideas. And here's some work that we put together. This is a spatial model. You can see we've got some virtual bass in that move around. They start in different areas. You've got nursery grounds in green, and you can see that they expand up during the summer, and then eventually they will start to contract back down again into the southwest. So we're in the process of including all of the kind of the tagging data that we've got. So you can see that we've got problems with this model because there's nothing staying in the North Sea, but you can also see that we can get biomass predictions of that over time, which is something that we need for the stock assessment. So the elephant in the room, climate change. People don't talk a lot about this, or they're starting to now, but bass is a southern species. It's something it's coming up from the south. Its optimum growth temperature is about 24 degrees. That's really when you get the maximum growth rates. And we know from the data that we've got that it's easier to predict the size of the year class from the temperature than from the actual, from the numbers of adults that you have. So this means that climate is going to be really, really important. And what's been done is that people have done these kind of species distribution models where you look at how suitable the habitat is for sea bass in terms of the temperature, the salinity, the acidity, and so on. You can get that from the climate model projections. And the good news for those of you that fish on bass is that bass are likely to move further north and further west. So we should see more bass coming into these areas. But what's unclear is how that might affect the ocean currents and the kind of pelagic phase, and whether we're going to end up with problems with settlement because of changes in the currents. So that's all I'm going to say. That's a whistle-stop tour through biology and ecology, and you'll hear lots more about that and get into more detail later. So now what I'm going to talk about is fisheries. Okay, right, we're going to have to shoot through fisheries. Oh, 10 minutes, okay, that's good. Right, so what I'm going to do here is just describe some of the fisheries that we have for sea bass. So what we have here, ICES are the people that run the stock assessment, and they collate data together from all the different countries. And these are people that come up with the catch advice, which results in the management measures that affect you. I'm involved in that. I shouldn't say these are the people. We are the people. So what you can see is on the left-hand side, you can see commercial landings by country. And you can see that basically there was a big increase. Generally, France had the highest exploitation of sea bass, followed by the UK. That was because they used to have a big pelagic pair trawling fleet. And then you can see in 2015, when the management measures start to come in, the French catches come down, and now the UK are probably the biggest exploiter in this area. You can also see the catches by gear. This is for 2023. You can see that lines and bottom trawls and fixed and drift nets are the biggest kind of commercial gears, but recreational is quite significant as well in terms of its take. And there are also quite a lot of discards. And you would expect, as the stock starts to recover, that you would end up with more discards. So what does that look like by gear types? You can see this is just for the UK now. You can see that basically here the UK landed 595 tons in 2021, which was consisting mainly of hook and line and fixed nets. The majority of it is also for the under 10s. It's the small guys that you're talking about here. These are the people that are fishing on bass commercially. It's not really the big guys, although this varies between ports around the UK. And you can see a higher proportion from fixed nets in the east than in the southwest. And the main landing ports are in the south and west, but it's economically important in the east. One of the things which is going to change as we increase as due to the management is discard survival is really important, and you'll all be aware of the landings obligation. That doesn't actually apply to bass because of the way it's managed, because it's managed by technical measures rather than a quota. But what we can say is that limited studies do exist. We've done some work on hook and line, and it's probably about 10%, would be my guess based on the way that they're fishing. But trawls and nets, it varies a lot depending on how people are operating those things. But generally, for things like static nets and trawls, there's very little survival. So maybe something that's interesting to you guys, the recreational fisheries. So this is, again, the total recreational fisheries by countries. This was data from 2012. And you can see basically, again, that that France were the largest exploiter at that time on the stock that we've got, and England were the next one. And you can see, again, this is the size frequencies of fish that were caught. And you can see that generally people kept bigger fish than they released. But there were some releases that we had that were below the minimum landing size. At that time, it was 36, not 42. So we can then move on to UK sea angling catches. And this is work that, again, is done with anglers. So we've got about 2,000 diarists around the UK that report their catches on a monthly basis to us. And we're able to use that alongside other information that we have on the numbers of anglers to estimate the total catches. So what you can see is the kept and release components around the UK, and you can see generally the catches and the releases are highest in the southwest and less so around the rest of the coast, but they are important fisheries. In theory, or this I think was for 2020, it might be 2023 now, sorry, I've checked, I need to change that on my slides, but generally the catch was around 303 tons and the release was about 1,000 tons. The thing you've got to think about is that there's a lot of sea anglers in the UK. Roughly, there's around 750,000, and if each of those takes 1 kilo of bass, that's essentially 750 tons. So it's the numbers that do it. It's not individual anglers taking a lot of fish, it's the numbers. So post-release mortality, again, you saw that the release component was quite high for the thing. And what we've tried to do is we've tried to work out how many of those fish that are released then died. What you can see is that there are very limited studies of those areas. We've got one study that was done in aquaculture facilities, and it was done for 10 days. And we looked at how different gears might affect it, whether it's bait versus lures that you're using, and the factors that might affect it in terms of the hook type that you use. Is it a J? Is it a single hook or a treble hook? Is it the hooking location? Are you hooking them deep? Are you hooking them in the mouth? Are you hooking them in other parts of the body? And the air exposure. And what we found was that generally there was 13% mortality, but generally baits were much, much worse for mortality than lures, because basically when fish were taking bait, they were engulfing it and it was going down and you were deep hooking. And that's a real problem in terms of the mortality. And this was in an aquaculture facility, in an aquaculture tank, so you could see the fish taking the bait. So it tells you a little bit about, you know, what might improve the survival of fish that you said. When you correct it for all the different practices and all the different countries, you get a stock-wide mortality of about 5%. So, stock assessment. We have 4 stocks of sea bass at the moment around Europe. We've got the main one that we're interested in is the one in orange. I call it the northern stock. And what we try to do with the stock assessment is we try to estimate the size of the stock, the fishing mortality that might be sustainable, and also the reference point. So what is a safe limit? So what you can see from these, this is the 2024 advice. So it's literally out the 30th of June. And what you can see is that generally what was happening, if you look at the spawning stock biomass, it fell off a cliff in around 2009, 2010. And that's why we started to think about management measures. And you can see on this fishing mortality, this drop is due to the management measures that have come in. So originally we were overfishing the stock, and now we're within safe limits. And what you can also see is since we've introduced that, the stock is starting to recover, but it's a bit more slow than you would expect. And what we think the reason for that is because we don't have good recruitment at the moment. So we've got a succession of poor year classes that are coming through from about 2010 onwards. These aren't big year classes that are coming through. So we haven't seen the traditional massive year classes that we did in the 90s and 80s. But this is all about to change. We've got a new assessment coming over, and there's been a lot of discussion about mixing between the stocks. So we know that bass swim, and they can swim round these corners. So they can swim round the Point de Bretagne. And there's a lot of issues with the approach that we've got. We've got issues with discards, we've got issues with catches, and we've got issues with the stock definition. So we're in the process of reworking the stock assessment to bring together the Northern and the Biscay stock in a combined model where we have exchange between them. And it's being done with angling and commercial involvement. Hannah has been involved in it and others around the table. And it will be used for the advice that will come out next year for 2026. So management, I'm not going to say a lot about management, but we've got this quandary. We've got this slow growing, high value commercial and recreational target. We've got large interannual variation in the year class strength, which is driven by the environment. The spawning stock biomass has declined rapidly. So how do we manage stocks? Well, at a European level, it's a shared approach. So we have the same measures in place for both commercial and recreational, as do France, as do the Netherlands, as do Ireland, so on and so forth. And the idea is that we basically, we've got shared management of both commercial and recreational using a mixture of catch limits and bag limits. You'll be well aware of the bag limits, minimum sizes and closed seasons. We also in the UK have many local bylaws and bass nursery areas, which you'll also probably be aware of. So I'm just going to say something about climate impacts on fisheries. So the link between climate and fisheries is quite difficult to understand. There are a lot of factors that affect the way that people fish. So if you think about it, this infographic is looking at the angling community specifically. And with climate, you might end up with better weather or worse weather. If you end up with better weather, you might fish more. If you end up with worse weather, as we've seen this year, in terms of the rain, we might fish less. But a big thing might be storminess, how often we have storms, how often can charter boats get out and boats to fish. We might have increased motivation. People might have better fishing opportunities. They want to get out more. We might have less opportunities. And the costs might change. It might become more expensive to fish or less expensive to fish. And all of these affect the way that the fishery will react to climate change. And what that does is it encourages people to either fish differently or they fish through driven changes, through management measures, or through directed changes, their kind of own way of doing it. I'm not going to say much about the economics. I'm almost done. I did warn you I was going to run over. I'm just going to say one thing about the economics, because this is really important as well, is that I get told a lot about the recreational community is worth 10 times as much as the commercial, or the commercial community, we're really important because we're businesses, we're worth much more than because we provide food. And the thing I wanted to say about the economics is that there are lots of ways to measure it. And generally, the way that we measure recreational is not the same as we measure commercial. And it's very, very difficult to measure them in the same way, because one is a producer and one is a consumer type approach. And these are measured on different scales, so direct comparison is challenging. So what I would say is that the communities need to work together to think about how we can optimize the benefits going forwards in terms of management. I think everyone wants the same thing in terms of fish for the future. So I think it's really important that we work together as sectors to do that. And that's it. Thank you very much.